Silence stretches across the Judean hills, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant clatter of hooves and the groan of leather armour. November 25th, 1177. You look at a boy who should have been dead years ago, his hands wrapped in linen stained dark with rust and rot. Leprosy doesn't just take flesh, it erases a man while he still breathes. And yet, here he is. The silver mask hiding his face glints in the pale dawn, reflecting a sun that has seen nothing like the horror yet to come. 3 miles ahead, the horizon trembles under the weight of 26,000 warriors. Green, black and gold banners snap violently in the wind, the colour of hunting birds circling a doomed prey. Saladin, 40 years old, undefeated, radiates calm confidence. He has already sent messengers ahead to Damascus, describing tomorrow's feast. Behind him, the air is thick with the smell of horse sweat, leather, and the metallic tang of sharpened swords. Every commander, every chronicler, every tactician in the known world would read these numbers and call it a slaughter waiting to happen. And yet, behind Baldwin IV, 500 knights stir on exhausted horses, armour dented, weapons dulled from battles no one remembers, hearts beating against the rhythm of impossible odds. 52 to 1. Numbers that do not invite discussion, only surrender. Every advisor, every seasoned veteran, every military treatise would have screamed, "Do not ride, do not challenge fate." And yet, Baldwin does. He leans forward in his saddle, the mask hiding a grin that only someone who's felt nothing but pain could muster. His body screams in protest, joints swollen, nerves destroyed, but the mind, oh, the mind is sharp as Damascus steel, seeing what others cannot. He gives the order, charge. In the next 3 hours, the laws of logic, probability, and human endurance will fracture. Christian chroniclers will call it divine intervention. Muslim historians will speak of catastrophe. Modern strategists will puzzle over the impossible. But the true story begins 3 days earlier, with a decision so correct, so logical, that it should have sealed the Crusaders' doom. And yet, it is that very decision that will unravel everything Saladin has built, as history, bloodied and unrelenting, watches. Jerusalem itself is a corpse pretending to breathe. Walls cracked, streets half empty, faith hanging by a thread. And in its centre, a boy king who has nothing left to lose, whose body is already betraying him, readies himself to defy death. Logic and history, all in a single afternoon. Baldwin IV wasn't meant to be king. At 13, he inherited a crown that history had already measured for a coffin. Leprosy, in the 12th century, wasn't just a disease, it was a sentence, a divine erasure of flesh and identity, a warning from God that this boy was not meant to survive. White patches crept over his skin, nerves deadened, joints stiffening. Lepers were buried in unmarked graves while still alive, erased from records, treated as ghosts. Yet Baldwin's father, King Amalric, saw something the disease could not touch, a mind honed like a blade, sharp enough to cut through despair and the impossible. By 1177, Saladin had united Egypt and Syria, forged an army of 26,000 men, elite Mamluks bred from childhood to kill, and siege engines that could crack stone as easily as eggs. Every strategy Baldwin's advisors could offer was already exhausted. Every calculation screamed doom. Europe had stopped sending reinforcements. The Pope, silent, negotiated the inevitable. Jerusalem's walls, cracked and half empty, offered little comfort. The kingdom existed on scar tissue, on hope, on denial. And yet, here sat a boy whose flesh betrayed him, whose hands could barely grip a sword, and whose will refused to bow to probability. The throne room smelled of incense and fear. Advisors whispered, knuckles white, as they spoke of death and negotiation. "We must yield," said one. "We cannot ride out against numbers like these," said another. But Baldwin's gaze was elsewhere. past the tapestries, past the worn banners, toward the horizon where the Sultan's forces were assembling like a storm incarnate. He did not see a hopeless fight. He saw opportunity. Every advisor had weighed the options: hide behind the walls and wait for famine to claim the people, or strike, knowing it was near suicide. Baldwin understood the mathematics. He understood the pain, the exhaustion, the blood, and yet he saw what no one else could. Saladin's logic, the patterns in his movements, the arrogance of certainty. If he could exploit it, even slightly, the impossible became real. And so he chose, not bravado, not desperation, strategy, sharpened by a body that no longer felt fear or pain. He would ride with 500 knights. He would confront 26,000. And he would do it on his terms, in a way history would never forgive, never fully explain. The knights, seeing their king strapped to a saddle, bandaged and broken, felt a madness stir in their own hearts. A silent recognition that they were about to follow a boy who had lost everything, into death, into legend, into a story that would echo across centuries. Night fell like a shroud over Jerusalem as Baldwin IV prepared his knights. Torches flickered against the cracked stone walls, casting grotesque shadows that danced like phantoms across the throne room. The king's hands, wrapped in linen that had once been white, were now a tapestry of rust and pus, useless for gripping unless strapped and bound. Yet he touched every knight's shoulder, offering words only a dying boy could command with such certainty. He didn't need to speak of fear, he embodied its opposite. The absence of sensation in his rotting flesh had given him a clarity no healthy man could imagine. The march began under the cover of darkness. 3,000 infantrymen and 500 knights, with Baldwin carried in a litter when his legs could no longer bear him, moved north toward the Sultan's scattered army. 45 miles in 36 hours, over terrain that would have broken ordinary horses, ordinary men, even ordinary kings. Exhaustion clawed at every rider, every foot soldier. Hunger, thirst and sweat mingled with the metallic tang of blood already staining armour from previous skirmishes. And yet every step, every painful motion was calculated. Baldwin's eyes, pale behind the silver mask, followed reports from scouts. Is Saladin still moving north? Are the forces still scattered? Yes, sire. Each answer made him smile. They didn't understand. Fever, fatigue, and fear twisted their perception. They assumed delirium. They assumed madness. Baldwin had seen a pattern that no one else could see. He was counting on Saladin's brilliance, on the Sultan making the most rational decision, the one that would unknowingly lead to disaster. Baldwin's mind was a weapon sharper than any sword, honed by necessity and unbroken by pain. At dawn the ridge appeared, rolling across the horizon like an endless sea of green and gold. Saladin's banners fluttered, and the Sultan, for the first time in his career, sensed unease. Scouts brought hurried reports, the Crusader force, small, near invisible, against the vast plain. He dismissed it initially. A patrol, he thought, a nuisance, and then the sun caught a glint, the silver mask of Baldwin IV rising over the ridge, catching the morning light like a herald of death. For 26,000 men, this should have been another skirmish, another predictable victory. Instead, it was the first glimpse of the impossible. A dying boy strapped to a horse, smiling through agony, leading 500 knights toward destiny. And in that instant, the battlefield's mathematics, 52-1, certain annihilation, began to crumble, because here pain no longer mattered, and neither did fear. Dawn spilled across the plain, revealing a landscape that would soon be soaked in blood. Saladin's forces were spread across 3 miles, looting villages, resting horses, confident in their inevitability. Nothing could stop them, or so they believed. And then from the northern ridge came the faint, impossible glint of silver. Baldwin IV sat upright, strapped to his saddle, the leper king grinning beneath a mask that reflected the rising sun like a second dawn. A scout's cry cut through the morning air. "The Crusaders! They are coming!" Saladin glanced up, dismissive at first. Patrols, he thought, too few to matter. Yet, as the figures approached, he saw them. 500 men, a line of white and red, moving as one, led by a boy whose body should have collapsed years ago. Fear whispered through the ranks of Mamluks, trained to kill without hesitation. These men had never known hesitation, until now. The terrain worked against Saladin. Ravines and gullies ignored by scouts funneled his army into choke points. Baldwin's knights would exploit them, turning nature itself into a weapon. Every step forward carried the weight of inevitability for those who had calculated only numbers and strength. Baldwin had nothing but the mind that disease could not touch, the will that pain could not break, and the certainty that fear could be weaponized as a contagion. Behind him, the Templars, in white surcoats and red crosses, moved like spectres. These men had taken vows of never retreating, never surrendering. The air thrummed with the combined pulse of horses and the anticipation of impossible deeds. Knights whispered prayers, some in Latin, some in quiet curses at their own mortality. All of them were aware they were about to charge 26,000 men. All of them understood the calculus of death, and yet none wavered. Saladin, observing from a hill, barked orders. "Form the centre! Protect the flanks! Hold the line!" But his voice, usually absolute, carried uncertainty. His elite soldiers, Mamluks raised from childhood for war, began to falter. Horses sensed something unnatural, a madness emanating from the ridge. And then, the first charge, Baldwin's hand, bandaged and broken, lifted a signal. Forward, a gesture so impossible it shattered the last illusion of control among the Sultan's army. The ground itself seemed to tremble as 500 knights surged down the slope. Their horses' hooves pounded in synchronized fury. The Leper King's smile, faint yet unshakable, led them like a compass that defied reason. At 400 yards, arrows rained down. Men fell, horses screamed, yet the wedge pressed forward. The impossible was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time, led by a boy whose body could not feel its own destruction. At 300 yards, Saladin's forces scrambled to form lines, but coordination failed. The elite Mamluks, raised from childhood to be instruments of war, froze in disbelief. They had trained for courage, for discipline, for the certainty of victory. They had never faced an opponent who radiated indifference to death itself. Baldwin IV, strapped to his horse like a corpse, advanced, sword tied to his wrist, bandaged hands gripping nothing but sheer will. His knights followed with a frenzy born of awe and desperation, hearts synchronized with the rhythm of impossible courage. 200 yards, and the first clash erupted. Horses screamed, steel met steel, and the plain became a crucible of chaos. Baldwin's formation pierced the centre like a blade through parchment, tearing open gaps no tactic could repair. Men fell screaming, weapons torn from grasp, blood and sweat mingling in a crimson fog. The Mamluks' discipline collapsed under the weight of something they could not understand, a force beyond fear, beyond pain, beyond calculation. 100 yards now, the Templar wedge, white and red against the green and gold of Saladin's banners, surged forward relentlessly. Knights who had whispered prayers now roared cries that blended grief, fury, and faith. The air itself seemed to shiver under their charge. Horses sensed the madness, the unrelenting will, and their hooves struck with unnatural precision. Baldwin leaned forward, his grin hidden beneath silver, every motion impossibly precise, his body a machine fueled by the absence of sensation. At 50 yards, the line of 26,000 shattered. Soldiers abandoned weapons, tore off armour, stumbling over one another in panic. The ravines funneling the fleeing army became death traps, natural kill boxes. Thousands suffocated under the weight of their own comrades. A Christian chronicler would write later, "The ravines filled with bodies like wells filling with water, until the dead made bridges for the dying to cross. a Muslim historian would echo, "We fled into the earth's mouth, and the earth devoured us." Saladin himself, stunned and unprepared, watched the collapse of everything he had built. His personal guard, 2,000 of the finest warriors, broke. Abandoned, surrounded, he mounted a racing camel, the only escape from a battlefield that had ceased to obey logic. By mid-afternoon, the impossible was complete. 20,000 dead or dying, 6,000 scattered into the desert, 500 knights standing victorious amidst the carnage. Baldwin IV had done what should have been beyond human capability. Not because of numbers, not because of equipment, but because he had transcended the very limitations of his body. And those who followed him understood what it meant to fight without fear, without pain, without hesitation. The battlefield fell silent, except for groans of the dying and the soft, wet squelch of blood under hooves and boots. Baldwin IV, finally lifted from his horse, was unconscious. The straps holding him upright had been the only thing keeping him alive through 3 hours of unimaginable exertion. His bandages were soaked with blood, the skin beneath weeping and torn. Odo of Santa, the Templar Grandmaster, wept openly, trembling at the sight of a boy who had defied death itself. "He cannot feel pain," he whispered to no one in particular. And that was the secret, the unthinkable weapon that had turned 500 into an unstoppable force. Baldwin's body had no warning system. He could not stop. He did not know when to stop. The knights gathered, some kneeling, some vomiting from exhaustion, others simply staring at the carnage. Around them, the desert plain was a landscape transformed, a sea of broken men and shattered horses. The banners of Saladin scattered like fallen leaves, tents, gold, weapons, and siege engines, everything the Sultan had brought to crush Jerusalem, was now the spoils of a victory so improbable that chroniclers struggle to explain it. Baldwin IV had not merely survived, he had broken the enemy's army, the Sultan's reputation, and the certainty of inevitability. That night, Jerusalem burned candles in every window. Church bells tolled for 72 hours straight. Priests called it a miracle. Peasants danced in the streets, shaking hands with knights whose very survival seemed as improbable as the morning sunrise. Yet inside the royal chamber, Baldwin's doctors debated amputations, infection, and the toll the battle had exacted. The disease, accelerated by the physical strain, was advancing faster than ever. Hands that had gripped swords now wept pus. Tissue that had clung to bones only hours earlier now threatened to collapse entirely. The cost of victory was as severe as the feat itself. Europe looked on with renewed hope. Castles that had been preparing to surrender began reinforcing walls. Reinforcements flowed slowly toward Jerusalem, inspired by the tale of a leper king who refused to die when the world expected him to. Yet, across Egypt and Syria, Saladin's loss was catastrophic. The carefully cultivated image of invincibility crumbled. The psychological damage exceeded the material. Lords began questioning his divinely ordained authority, and it would take a decade for him to rebuild what Baldwin destroyed in a single afternoon. And Baldwin had achieved the impossible, yet his body paid the ultimate price. Each victory etched deeper into his flesh and bones. Each triumph a reminder that mortality is relentless, even in the presence of transcendent will. For 8 more years he would fight, blind, broken, and decaying, defending Jerusalem against forces that outnumbered him tenfold, never retreating, never surrendering, always guided by a mind unbroken by the body it inhabited. Time stretched strangely after Montgisard. Baldwin IV remained the king, but not the same boy who had smiled beneath his silver mask as 26,000 warriors crumbled before him. His body betrayed him more visibly with each passing day. Eyes that had scanned battlefields with unnerving clarity began to cloud. Limbs that had carried him through impossible charges trembled at the simplest motion. Yet the mind remained untouched, a razor's edge honed by necessity, sharpened against the grindstone of mortality. Every decision, every command carried the weight of a kingdom that had come within hours of annihilation. Saladin did not strike again immediately. The Sultan, usually confident to the point of arrogance, spent months recalculating, regrouping, and questioning the foundations of his dominion. Muslim chroniclers record his bewilderment, his disbelief at a victory that defied the very laws of warfare. God turned his face from us that day, one lamented. The psychological wound ran deeper than the material losses. The aura of inevitability Saladin had cultivated over 15 years, the sense that every Crusader state would crumble before him, was shattered in the afternoon sun by a boy no army should have survived to lead. Baldwin, in the meantime, navigated a kingdom that saw him alternately as a miracle and a ghost. Towns once abandoned began to repopulate, walls were reinforced, and reinforcements from Europe trickled in. Every success was a testament not just to his strategy, but to the way he manipulated perception, the way his indomitable presence inspired men to feats no ordinary king could command. Knights whispered of the leper king as if he were part legend, part avenging spirit. His silver mask became a symbol, a signal that courage could transcend flesh, that willpower could defy the certainty of mathematics. Yet Baldwin's body paid the cost. The stress of Montgisard accelerated his leprosy exponentially. Infection spread through tissue that could not heal. Fingers swelled grotesquely, limbs stiffened beyond remedy. Every battle he commanded afterward, though victorious, brought him closer to death. And still, he refused to yield, refusing to retreat behind Jerusalem's walls when danger loomed. He became more than king. He became a living monument to human determination, a paradox, fragile yet invincible, decaying yet unstoppable. Even Saladin, in later encounters, recognized this. In 1183, under a flag of truce, he met Baldwin, now blind and carried on a litter. The Sultan observed the frail boy who had haunted him for years and admitted, through chroniclers, "I do not understand how God could give such a mind to such a body." Baldwin's whispered reply, barely audible, revealed the essence of his life. Perhaps so that when I win, no one can claim it was by strength alone. The years after Montgisard became a cruel ballet of survival. Baldwin IV, once a boy of 16, now moved through a kingdom in which every breath, every step, was a negotiation with mortality. His body, ravaged by leprosy, had become a map of decay. Fingers fused, limbs stiffened, joints swollen to grotesque proportions. Yet within that frail frame burned a mind sharper than any sword, a will that refused the natural law of death. Knights whispered that to follow him was to follow fate itself, that his presence on the battlefield could turn certainty into chaos and chaos into victory. Saladin, meanwhile, rebuilt methodically, 20,000 dead, supplies lost, his aura of invincibility shattered. He could recover material losses, but the psychological scar Baldwin left would linger a decade. Muslim leaders questioned whether the Sultan was truly chosen, whether divinely sanctioned inevitability was real, or just an illusion shattered by human will. Every campaign he mounted against the Crusader states thereafter was haunted by the memory of Montgisard, by a boy whose flesh had betrayed him, yet whose mind had turned the rules of war upside down. Baldwin's victories continued, always against overwhelming odds. Never more than 1,000 knights accompanied him, never with the expectation of survival, yet victory followed like a shadow. Jerusalem, fragile and scarred, became a bastion of hope, not because of walls or weaponry, but because one boy refused to accept the laws of probability. Chroniclers on both sides described battles as miracles, catastrophes, or divine tests, but all agreed Baldwin had rewritten the rules of human endurance, and still the disease gnawed relentlessly. Nightmares of his own body, of tissue rotting from within, haunted him. Sleep offered no relief. Every battle, every march, every council was undertaken in pain too immense for most men to comprehend. His hands, which once gripped swords and led charges, could barely hold quills to sign decrees. Physicians warned, begged, and threatened, yet he ignored them. A kingdom depended on him, not on flesh or fortune, but on the singularity of his will. In private moments, Baldwin reflected on mortality, on divine purpose, on the strange justice that allowed his mind to dominate where his body failed. He wrote letters to his sister, to nobles, to allies, chronicling not victories but philosophy, that flesh is temporary, but will is eternal, that mathematics does not govern outcomes, only courage and determination do. His words became lessons for the living, warnings for the complacent, and legacies for the future. By 1185, Baldwin IV had become a living paradox. Blind, crippled, and ravaged by leprosy, he was incapable of performing the most basic tasks of daily life, yet armies, kingdoms, and empires seemed to obey him simply because he willed it. Every order he gave carried the weight of inevitability. Knights moved at his command, as if guided by some invisible force, and enemy generals hesitated, haunted by the memory of Montgisard, fearful of repeating a defeat that defied reason. He had become less a man and more an idea, a personification of unstoppable human will. Saladin, having waited 2 years after Baldwin's death, finally moved to conquer Jerusalem. The timing was no coincidence. The Sultan had studied Baldwin's victories, recalculated, and waited for the fragile human element to vanish. Baldwin's successors, untested and weak, could not replicate his clarity of mind or his disregard for personal danger. In months, the kingdom he had fought so fiercely to protect fell into enemy hands. The lesson was stark. One man's refusal to accept inevitability can hold a kingdom together. But when that man dies, the fragile structure collapses. Baldwin's letters, preserved in archives, reflect his understanding of this fragile dynamic. I was told I would die young. They were right. I was told I could not rule. They were wrong. Flesh is temporary, will is eternal. These words were not philosophical musing. They were doctrine, a command to those who would remember. Baldwin had wielded his body as a weapon, and when the weapon failed, he left behind a testament to the force of unyielding intent. Even historians struggle to reconcile Montgisard. Modern military analysts calculate force ratios, supply lines, and cavalry effectiveness, yet the numbers never add up. 500 men could not, by conventional logic, destroy 26,000. And yet they did. The answer lies not in mathematics, but in psychology. The ability to inspire unwavering belief, to convert fear into obedience, to exploit human frailty, and to transcend the very instincts that keep a man alive. Baldwin IV weaponized the absence of pain and fear, transforming personal limitation into strategic advantage. In the end, Montgisard teaches something terrifying. History pivots not on the strongest armies, the richest coffers, or the most brilliant strategies. It pivots on those who refuse to accept limitation, who push beyond probability, who seize the moment when others cower. Baldwin IV's life, brief, agonizing, yet incandescent, reminds us that one individual, willing to embrace suffering beyond reason, can alter the course of nations. Baldwin IV's death in 1185, at the age of 24, marked the end of a life, both extraordinary and tragic. The boy who had smiled beneath a silver mask, who had led 500 knights against 26,000, whose body betrayed him at every turn, yet whose mind remained invincible, was gone. The kingdom he had saved, defended single-handedly in every meaningful sense, would not survive long without him. His successors lacked the vision, the courage, the indomitable will that had allowed a dying teenager to hold back the tide of history. Jerusalem, the city he had kept alive through brilliance and pain, fell within years. And yet, Baldwin's story was not simply one of loss. It was a testament, a warning, a lesson etched in blood and memory. For 8 years, Baldwin had defied not only disease but the immutable laws of human limitation. Painless, fearless, unrelenting, he had weaponized his very decay, turning the absence of sensation into a strategic advantage. His knights followed because they witnessed the impossible. A king fighting with a body that should have crumbled, leading men who, inspired by his example, refused to die on command, but to die on purpose, on principle, on the unshakable belief that will could bend reality itself. Historians still puzzle over Montgisard. Armies study it, generals debate it, military theorists scratch their heads over diagrams and probability charts. 500 against 26,000. No siege weapons, no numerical advantage, no logistics sufficient to explain the outcome. And yet, it happened. Not because of skill alone, nor terrain, nor luck, but because Baldwin understood what numbers cannot capture. The human heart, the mind unshackled from fear, the transformative power of relentless intent. Modern life rarely teaches these truths. We rely on probabilities, algorithms, models, and forecasts. We assume that strength, numbers, and preparation dictate the outcome. Baldwin IV reminds us otherwise. History pivots on the audacious, the relentless, the ones who refuse to accept their own limitation. He reminds us that courage is not simply boldness, it is the conscious embrace of suffering beyond the point most men can endure. That is the weapon that won Montgisard. That is the force that can change the world. As you watch the past unfold, consider this: civilization, kingdoms, empires, even the course of human events, hinge on moments like this, on individuals willing to transcend flesh, to defy calculation, to push beyond all odds. Baldwin IV did not merely fight battles, he fought the impossible. He held back history with his will alone, and in doing so, he left behind a truth every man must confront. Sometimes one person can hold the line against the world, and for a moment, nothing else matters.